How you doing? That was a pretty good lunch on the beach. My name is Sarah Drasner. I'm here to talk to you about false dichotomies. This is like some of the overarching themes as I look back on some of the work that I've done and the work that I'm continuing to do are some of these ideas. So I just want to share them with you today. I am a manager of UX design and engineering at Trulia, and I have this relationship with authority forever in my life. That is my mom, and she's going to come up again a little bit later. Before we cover what false dichotomies are and what they do to our psyche, it's probably pretty good to cover what a false dichotomy is. It's presenting two alternatives when in reality more exists. So if you ever hear somebody say, well, you're either this kind of person or you're that kind of person, then it's just not taking into the full breadth of what people can be. So in code, that would be if A equals some input else, or rather else if. I'm going to kind of be bringing together some of the ideas that I work with in design and engineering through this talk. So why dichotomies? Like, why are they interesting? Why should we care about them? Why do we even make them to begin with? They're actually really important. When I talk about false dichotomies and dichotomies in general, know that I'm critiquing something that I really love. Categorization is really interesting in the way that our minds process all sorts of kinds of information. So it really is the key that Western thinking has come to understanding. When you think about Platonic ideals, I don't know if you guys are familiar with those, but Plato back in the olden days in classical antiquity times was kind of thinking about this idea of, well, we can talk about circles, right? That this circle, that if I say to you, draw a circle, you're going to draw a circle. But that circle that you've drawn, that particular circle, is not really what I've asked for. I've asked for something that both of us are always going to be thinking about, which is this other circle that's in both of our minds that we're sharing a concept of. So that is one key way that we're categorizing something in order to understand it, in order to communicate. The Enlightenment was this kind of resurgence of things. So if you think about classical, like old, like ancient Greece, and then you think about this resurgence of classical stuff. So if you go back through time and you look at Enlightenment buildings, they actually look a lot like the ones from Greece. Now, why is that? That's not actually an accident. It's because they were really enthralled with those ideas. There were the dark ages in between where people had lost all of this knowledge. They're walking with huge heavy buckets of water past aqueducts going, man, those are probably for something, right? But so this Enlightenment way of thinking was this resurgence of kind of the importance of figuring out categorical order. One of the things that developed during the Enlightenment were encyclopedias and dictionaries. We think of encyclopedias and dictionaries at their current form as being something that has always existed. But the way that we categorize things now mostly come from the Enlightenment. This was a really big time for people to say, okay, there's a lot of chaos in the universe, and I'm going to organize it in order to understand it. So from that we come to the Linnaean system of classification. So basically you have all these crazy animals and they're all really beautiful. And how do you separate one from the other? How do you figure out where that line is drawn? So I read a book a while ago that really affected me. It's called Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, What Categories Reveal About the Mind. It's very, very dry, but I'm going to sum it up for you. This quote is actually a pretty good summation, which has a category bellum that actually includes women, fire, and dangerous things. This is not simply a matter of categorization by common properties. Categorization is not a matter to be taken lightly. So they're talking in this quote about a tribe that used these words to categorize things, and the way that they did so actually shaped the way that people thought about things, and we have a lot of those in our culture too. It's a little bit easier to look at other people's cultures in order to understand things because we're so embedded in our own. So that kind of leads to one of the big overarching, we're going to go deal with a lot of false dichotomies through this talk, but one of the big ones, and that's been kind of an overarching presence in my life, is this idea that art and STEM are totally separate. And I'm kind of critical of that because I like both very passionately. So what I always hear are things like, I'm an engineer, I can't draw, or I'm an artist and I can't code. And this is not a talk about why you need to code. I just need to say that right now. But it actually isn't, it's a fairly new premise that these things be totally separated. If you look at some of the drawings of Galileo, I don't know about you, but like that stands up. That could be like a dribble shot today. This is gorgeous. It was really commonly accepted that scientists, in order to understand and explain their ideas, would actually have to draw them. And another really big example that's kind of obvious is Audubon. Audubon did these gorgeous prints, and he was a naturalist and he was a biologist. And that idea of like communicating in multiple ways or thinking in multiple ways, that dichotomy is a fairly new one. So this is my mom, again, she's adorable and I'm not biased at all. But the reason why I'm showing you this slide is because she's a pretty famous neurologist, and my entire family is a group of scientists. And that's really important to who I am, because it's always kind of been embedded in like my thought processes and the way that I work with things. This Facebook quote was too good to not include. That's my cousin. If you ever really want to piss off a family of scientists, make art. This was the most effective way of really annoying my parents that I found as a teenager. So I draw a lot. These are done with ballpoint pen pretty much, and some acrylic on the right. So just tiny little cross hatches. I've always been a doodler. I always liked drawing. I like drawing a lot, so I do a lot of it, and that's like a pretty important piece of who I am. I also code. I'm really, really interested in engineering. In fact, this is my first design conference. I'm usually speaking at things like Fluent about code only. So this is not the book I'm writing. This is my friend trolling me. It's not even my last name. This is the book I'm writing. I'm about halfway done, but I talk a lot about SVG animations. I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the end, but we're going to kind of go through a little bit more of the artistic process before we get there. I thought in order to kind of introduce you to some of my animation work, this would be a good one because we're like basically in San Diego on the beach and it's kind of a party. So we can like make a party by like rotating this wheel here. Or we can have JavaScript do the event coordination with us, get it event. Lots of bad jokes where that one came from. Yeah, sometimes I just do these like silly little things on CodePen to have some fun on the weekends. Yeah, again, we're reiterating, this is not a talk about why you need to code. That is not what's important about this speech. What's important about it is just the lines that we draw for ourselves. In undergrad, I used to do a lot of printmaking. I was really into this idea of scientific categorization, so I would do these like fake scientific illustrations where I was like, oh, I'm a scientist. And this one's about the bird flu epidemic, and it's supposed to be kind of like a little bit silly and like making fun of the idea of categorization. Well, I mean, obviously I'm a big fan of it, otherwise I wouldn't be etching old plates of metal and doing all of this stuff. The other one on the right is one about nemesis and the idea of a nemesis. It's an old antiquity character, and then also like a nerdy spaceship, if you know anything about that. Right after college, I decided to scare the crap out of myself and move to Switzerland to be a nanny, which was really, I was a terrible nanny. But I did get a lot of chance to explore because Switzerland is right in the middle of everything. I didn't even know that before I left. So I would go to Rome on the weekends and draw the Vatican, or I would draw people that I met along the way. So that was really, really fun when I came out of college. So I moved back to Chicago. I went to the Art Institute of Chicago, and I had always been kind of fascinated with the Field Museum. We drew there a lot when I was in college, and I was like, oh, I gotta like keep that up because I just really love that place. I love the animals, I love the grandeur of it, I love the way that everybody was categorizing everything. So I went in there, I was working at a cafe, and I went in there on the weekends and drew. So my art kind of started with these like drawing reality and also splitting it apart. So I would draw like washing machines on top of themselves. So I would kind of get into this idea of like really getting into that rendering of the thing and then try to break it apart, so that you're never giving the viewer like fully what they want. So there's some tension there. So I did a whole bunch of these series of kind of categorization drawings, and I called up the Field Museum and I asked the herpetology division if they would let me come draw some of the jars there. I'd seen them on a school trip, and they said yes. So I started hanging out down there and drawing these jars, and something unbelievable happened. They asked me if I wanted a job, which I thought was pretty cool. So I became a scientific illustrator. I started drawing snakes and lizards for encyclopedias and dictionaries, and for someone who's like nerdily into this idea, this was like pretty much my dream job. So I got really into like Linnaean system of classification and how they did that. So at the time, what they would do is they take these animals and they basically write out like a checkmark list and say like, okay, does it have these features? Does it have scales? Yes or no? Does it like bask in the sun? Yes or no? And write out this like giant list, and that's how they make the Linnaean system of classification. They start to order all of the things that have the most similar characteristics together. So for my artist statement, this is horribly designed. For my artist statement, I made a morphology tree of my thoughts of like my creative process, my thoughts while I'm making artwork. So it actually changed from a phylogenetic analysis to a phylosynaptic analysis, because synapses in your brains instead of genes. So I wrote down all of these things that I thought for the first half hour while I was making a piece. So it starts off with things like inspiration and development of concept and relationship of shapes. And then it goes into things like what would people say in crit, and self-loathing, and contemplation of life as a corporate lawyer. And so, you know, and then I made all of these categories, you know, some of them are like art and theory, others are decision making, and then the last one is narcissism, which like falls into every single category, so that category is eliminated in that process. So, you know, super nerdy, and just trying to like keep going with that idea of categorization and order, and like embracing it, and at the same time like making fun of it. I think I showed this to one of the curators I was working for, like as a critique thing. I thought maybe he could like give me a critique like you get in art school. That did not go well. He was just like, what is this? So then this other thing happened, which is, I don't know if you realize that the reason why we still had scientific illustration is because we have apertures on these cameras, and there's like a certain depth of field. So if you have these really, really small objects, you could never get them to be in focus all at the same range. Well, while I was working at the Field Museum, they came out with a kind of camera that took pictures all the way through and composited those images, and then they had what you have on the right, which is like a perfectly crisp image all the way through, which quickly ended my career as a scientific illustrator. So this was 2002, and I wanted to still work there, and they wanted to keep having me there because we were buddies and things like that. And so they were like, well, you know, do you code? And I was like, oh yeah, sure. So I picked up this book on HTML for dummies in a weekend. And like back in those days, you actually could just like learn this in a weekend. And I made my first site ever for the Field Museum, which was this Goose Barnacles of the genus Octolasmus site. This is all built-in tables, and like when you flip the pages, it's actually just like inline JavaScript. It's terrible code, don't look at it. So I had kind of that under my belt, and was like continuing to work at the Field Museum and having a really nice time, still doing drawings for them sometimes. Then something happened. I was getting on the bus one day, and the bus driver didn't see me and closed the door on my wrist and started to go. And I heard a popping sound. And that popping sound was the sound of a lot of the tendons in my wrist breaking. So what ended up happening was, what I should have done basically is take some time off to recover. I did go to occupational therapy and stuff, but I was on contract with the Field Museum. I didn't have medical insurance. I really didn't have a way of surviving if I didn't stay at my job. So I kept working, which was a mistake. I shortly thereafter went to graduate school, partially because I was like, well, maybe if I'm not working, I can just like, accrue some debt and student loans. But eventually I'll become a teacher and everything will be fine. But graduate school isn't a place for slacking off either, and you still have a lot of deadlines and a lot of stuff to make. So my art, as it's like kind of this like crazy cross-hatching process, you can see a detail shot on the right, went from this back to the etchings, which even though there are a lot of cross-hatching, are a little bit looser, to this, which is like, painting, but I'm obviously getting a little bit looser because I have to, because I'm gonna want to paint, to this, which was painted with my left hand because my right hand stopped working. And then eventually, I couldn't even brush my teeth. I was in pain all the time. I just couldn't even put on my pants. Everything became arduous. My left hand wasn't used to all of the work that it was doing, so it was also becoming kind of tired. And things were not looking so great. This caused me to have to do the most difficult thing that I've ever had to do, which was to slow down. I really didn't have a kind of safety net around me for this kind of thing. My parents, even though they're very supportive, were not supportive of the idea of just resting. And I didn't have another way of going or working. Like everything around my life was like this, I need to keep working in order to survive kind of mentality. So I kept on trying my best or like stopping work, and there was lots of stop and starts, and it was very uncomfortable for a little while. Louisa gave a really great talk about the benefits of yoga, and I can't actually say enough about the benefits of yoga, but unlike Louisa, I did not go quietly into yoga and meditation. I wish that I had. This was a really, really tough process for me to let go of the thing that I felt like was my identity, was this drawing and art and creative process. So it basically turned into a 2-year affair of me trying to get better and not really getting better, and doctors telling me that like I might not be able to use my arm anymore. And it wasn't until I went to one doctor who recommended biofeedback that I started to understand things. For those unfamiliar with biofeedback, what they do is it's pretty incredible. They hook you up to all these wires, and they hook the wires to your brain and your hands, and you sit there, and they tell you they give you these like things that you can see and monitor. So one of the reasons I wasn't getting better is when you're really, really stressed out, all of the blood that you have goes into your head and your feet to think and run away, like fight or flight. And when no blood is in your arms, the temperature in your arms drop, and when you're stressed out, and blood is really what it takes to heal you, because blood carries oxygen and all of these things. So they're trying to calm you in order to have you understand that that relationship between stress and healing is actually a really strong one. So they sat me in the chair, and they hooked me into these sensors, and I could see kind of stress levels and temperature, and they had me breathe a certain way, and within 2 minutes, because of the way that I was breathing, I raised the temperature in my hands by 10 degrees. That's unbelievable. It was unbelievable to me, like that just thinking about things could change your biology in such a way. And because I just am like naturally curious, I decided to tempt the machines, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna think about something that stresses me out, and I thought about it, and the machines just crash, and like it's like beep, beep, and she's just like, whatever you're thinking about, stop. So after that, I was kind of more of a believer in meditation, in yoga, in those kind of therapies, and that was really actually the key for me getting better and like being better in the future. So this one is actually like still hard for me. I still struggle with this. That productivity is not a Boolean. It's not that you're either getting things done or resting. That rest can come in all sorts of productive forms. So during this time, of course, I can't like sit still very well. 2 years is a very long time to just sit. I was taking out medical loans for like emergency medical loans for school and accruing a lot of debt during that time to not be in school and not have those deadlines. But I figured, like I was listening to this NPR special about this assignment that people were doing, this like volunteer work, and it was through the Cartoon Art Museum in San Francisco. You could volunteer to teach illiterate kids or undereducated kids how to read and write through making autobiographical comic books. And I was like, how cool is that? So I signed up for this like teaching thing, which was great because I wasn't using my arms, I was just teaching. And I had the same students year after year. So I had 3rd grade, 4th grade, and 5th grade students. So I would watch them kind of grow as the years went on. And something that was really interesting to me, something that was just profoundly interesting to me, and just looking at all of this false dichotomy stuff, was that I'd have the same students and they'd be so good at drawing in 3rd grade. And then they'd be so good at drawing in 4th grade. And then in 5th grade, there was one kid who'd say, oh yeah, I'm the drawer. And everybody else would be like, yeah, I can't draw. And I'm like, you were drawing these crazy spaceships last year. What happened over summer break where like now you can't draw? And I just thought that was kind of crazy that we like hit a certain point where we become self-conscious and we decide that we can't do things. You go up to any 5-year-old kid and ask them if they can draw, they're gonna think you're crazy. Like they're gonna be like, of course I can draw. What are you? And you go up to adults and you ask the same question, and most of them are gonna say no. So I just thought this idea of I can't was really, really interesting. And like just getting to the core of like what happens to us in that time that makes us separate out what we think we can do and what we think we can't do. So continuing on, this is my graduate degree. I eventually did get better and I decided to make these giant paintings. This one is bigger than even the slide. It's like twice as big as me or something. So I don't know if you know about allegorical paintings, but allegorical paintings are these old paintings where like everything has a meaning. I was really sad when they demoted Pluto from being a planet. So this painting is called The Demotion of Pluto. If you know the story at all, it's because they found a planet bigger than it on the Kuiper Belt. So that planet's name is Eris, and she's the goddess of strife and discord. She's the one who presents a golden apple to a bunch of goddesses, to like the fairest goddess, and starts the Trojan War back in the day. So there's Eris. She's holding a pear in this case because Pluto was thought to not be big enough to be like actually rotating enough to become a complete sphere. It was thought to be pear-shaped. Also on the pear that you can't see right now because it's too small, on the original pear it said Kaliste, which is to the fairest, and I just wrote Kalo in Greek, which is fair. And then the dwarf on the side is because he's a dwarf planet. They're both wearing brown because that was the name of the researcher was named Brown, who discovered it. She's wearing the Kuiper Belt, and on it is a cube, a B, and one O because these types of planets are called QB1Os. The Lyell Observatory is in the background there, which is where they saw all of those things. So I made a couple of these types of paintings and then made little keys for all of the different meanings of them. And then the next step was pretty interesting. So there's a couple of dichotomies here that I've heard of. It's like art and life. You're pursuing a creative career, or you're like, you know, it should be putting food on the table, but I'm using the George W. Bush quote of putting food on our families. Or success, which is like quality of life, or dollar bills, y'all. So I moved to Greece to become a college professor for study abroad programs for students like RISD and UCLA, and all sorts of manners of schools would come to us. And I lived on this island called Paros. And I would say, actually, like, I went there for 3 months and stayed for 4 years. And that's why. And I had a really, really amazing time there, just like teaching all of the students how to draw and paint and historical sites and running around to the different islands and kind of teaching in that experience. That's me like pointing at things for my students on Santorini. So we had a really great time. But something else became apparent, again, through teaching. And when you're a college student, it's this interesting time because you're just out of high school. High school has this kind of like B+ culture approach where everybody's like, I don't care about school. Like, it's cool not to care. And then all of a sudden you're in college where you're like paying for your education and you're electing to be there, but like they can't shake the like it's cool not to care thing. Like that's like really uncomfortable. So when I was there, I was thinking a lot about the teachers that I'd had that really influenced me. And I noticed that the common thread wasn't that they were all teaching the same subject or that they were even teaching things that interested me. What really the common thread was their enthusiasm for the subject matter. That they just didn't care about looking cool, that they would just make terrible jokes at the expense of themselves and just kind of like make an ass out of themselves. And so I kind of started to just try that with my students and just try to like get super interested in whatever I was talking about, and it really worked. So the other dichotomy of being cool and caring versus not caring. I don't think that this isn't an original quote by me, but I can't find the original quote. I know that someone else has said something like this before. I do think that caring is a very courageous thing to do. You're putting yourself out there, you're saying something matters to you, and that comes we've learned through life by other people making fun of us, by people telling us that whatever we like sucks or whatever, that caring puts you in a vulnerable state. But sometimes that care is really the difference between what is making you a casual participant and really, really awesome. So in the summers, I used to go to Santorini, which is a neighboring island. You might have seen pictures of it. Usually if they show pictures of islands of Greece, they show Santorini because it's really beautiful. I tutored a Byzantine icon painter there. He didn't need to be tutored. This is one of his paintings. They're amazing and gorgeous and tall, but he was kind of like lifetime learner type of person. So he would have me stay with him and teach him kind of more photorealistic drawing so that he could kind of expand the bounds of what he knew, which was inspiring for me as well. I came to a problem. I think, I mentioned before that I accrued all this debt from having those emergency medical loans that I took out. The school provided a house for me and a car and covered my travel expenses, but they paid me a whopping $10K a year. Now, I don't know if any of you guys have student debt. You can't keep deferring those forever. Turns out you have to pay those back eventually. And $10K a year was like, in that setting, was like something that I was willing to do for 4 years. And at the end of 4 years was something that I couldn't do anymore. So I moved back to San Francisco. I'm from San Francisco, so it wasn't like me venturing to San Francisco, it was me returning home. And I worked at this agency that kind of like did a ton of work. I had 60 clients at any given time. I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with agency work. I became a much better programmer while I was working agency because you're just thrown at a million projects all the time. I was also doing design work and dev work for them. And I don't know if you know this, but the romance novel industry is actually a $1.08 billion industry. I had no idea that this was true until I had them as clients. This woman wanted a French Baroque mantelpiece for a website, so I took 2012 or whatever, 2010, whatever year it was, and skinned it to make it look like that, which was silly and funny. And I was making all sorts of ridiculous and giggle-worthy sites. So this is one of them. This was my first responsive site, and when I was like, ooh, JavaScript. So this is obviously not portfolio worthy work, and I'm not going to go through my whole product portfolio, but just the amount of detail that was kind of thrown away in flat graphics is kind of hilarious and awesome. So I also just started getting really, really into coding in general and just doing things that were only dev real projects. This is not a long ago one. This is just a responsive layout with React and React Motion. So I was playing around with some of this stuff recently, and also to show how you could use a type of preserve aspect ratio for SVG. So sometimes I just do these kind of Debbie projects. At the time, I was still trying to marry my drawing ideas and some of my dev ideas, but I was like, parallax. And this is a site that I made because I really like capoeira. Capoeira is a Brazilian dance form that's actually a type of martial art because they weren't allowed to do martial arts or practice martial arts, so they disguised it by making it into this beautiful dance. So this is an older site that I made, a few years ago. I also made this pen on CodePen. This was like probably right when CodePen started. I'm going to show a lot of CodePen projects because I really like them. This pen was wildly unsuccessful on CodePen. I have like a lot of pens that have gotten a lot more views than this one that took me like 3 weeks to make. That like other pens that I made like in an afternoon are like have like 5 times the views of this one, but I still like it, so I'm going to show it to you. So in 2015, for flash forwarding, I had a New Year's resolution that I really wanted to publish an article on CSS tricks. If you're mostly in the designer world and you don't use code that much, you might not be familiar with it, but if you have done any CSS, you've probably come across the site somewhere at some time because they're always like the #1 or #2 hit. I think Chris Coyer has like actually elevated all of us as developers. So I really like enjoyed this site and think it's really great. It helped me a lot, so I really wanted to like give back to the community. And I told myself that I couldn't. I was like very sure that I could not do this, and my best friend and fiance were like, nope, you're going to, nope, you're going to, and kind of like kept on telling me to, and I'm just like, this whole idea for me of like, I can't, no, stop, like, this can't even be, before I even tried anything. And I'm like, just send him the article and just see. So they actually were right, and the timestamp on that is not actually that far down the line. It's January 27th. So I published my first article, which was called Weighing SVG Animation Techniques with Benchmarks. So I did all of these timeline recordings, sort of super nerdy JavaScript stuff, and then did some visual benchmarking with a tool called Fismo, and weighed all of these different animation techniques, wrote the same animation over and over again because I was curious. Everybody was saying how good their stuff performed, and this thing is better than this thing, and I'm not part of any of those structures or organizations, so I felt like it was a pretty good chance for me to do it because like I'm not very biased. I guess like the segue between these two things is that I met Chris at a conference a little bit later and we became buddies, and he asked me to come on CSS Tricks for full time, which was just really, really exciting, and I've just been having a great time writing articles for them. So this was one of the ones that came out super recently in May, which was a comparison of web animation technologies. I also wrote one about Lingo. Since the Noun project's here talking about Lingo, I thought it was just a really quick direct link, but I thought I'd put it in. Chris let me do these kind of like, asked me to do these like little Easter eggs on the site. So if you go to the top bar and you hit that, there's this kind of like morphing animation. I tried to make it like techie, so there's like the link and the fork, and like our logo is the Query Selector All-Star. So I was playing with like Saturn and the star and brackets, that kind of stuff. So it's been really fun. I also like spent a lot of time on CodePen, which he also is a founder for. I'm like nerd girl, like fangirl for CodePen. So I made this CodePen propaganda poster in Soviet St. Diego. The CodePen is loaded with you, and just have a lot of fun on that site making goofy projects. I also think that like people don't often explore that idea of that philosophical thought can be playful and meaningful. I've talked about that a little bit in like artist statement and stuff, but I like to play around with these false dichotomies even in a kind of humorous way, or about like love and life. So I'm making this tragic love story between a cactus and a balloon. TBD for how that goes. I also make these like kind of silly pens about this guy. Super creepy. All of these pens are built with SVG. I've become like a big proponent of SVG. I really like that it's crisp on every display. It can have really small file size if you design for performance. There's less HP requests to handle. It's really easy to animate because you have a navigable DOM. It's really good for accessibility. I have full talks about this. I'm not going to go too far into it. But I am going to talk about some of the false dichotomies that you might not know about within SVG. It's built with math. It's vector. It's like Illustrator versus Photoshop, right? You're familiar with bitmaps versus these kind of paths that we're drawing. So there's a lot of capabilities to like keep things crisp on Retina displays and ways to manipulate them. So sometimes I do these kind of, it's probably better full screen, I do these kind of like narrative works that are shorts in SVG.
Did you see that?
So, and then this one was a Reddit cartoon that I really liked, but I decided to make one out of cosine out of. So I was thinking about like pushing the bounds of that even further. Like, what if we get like more complex, and there's interaction, and there's animation, and we're going to make it responsive. SVG is really good because it's scalable. That's in the name, scalable vector graphics. So pushing the boundaries of that is like pushing the boundaries of what graphics and animation can be on the web, because I really don't feel like we're pushing that. Like, the web has actually seen a really good heyday for these things. So I did this like Book of Kells, modern day Book of Kells illustration, and I thought about what it would look like on all displays. And then, in the code, I was kind of like drawing it out and figuring out similar shapes so that I could make a sprite out of it. And then I made this little guy who, when you scroll it down, like actually adjusts to the viewport. The amazing thing about this pen is actually not what you just saw, but the fact that it's 6 kilobytes. That's all of the code for the graphic and all of the animation. The entire thing is 6 kilobytes. So you compare that to using just like a common photo on a website, and you got something pretty engaging. So I feel very strongly about this. I do all these like talks about it, and I was kind of playing around with the idea that like when you're making animations inside the SVG DOM, it really actually scopes the animation to that space. So if I'm going to replay that and like randomly resize it, the animation scales with the SVG, which is pretty cool. And so I took it one step further, and we're going to bring out that like Huggy Laser Panda guy again. I thought about like maybe where that Huggy Laser Panda is made, like a factory for Huggy Laser Pandas. And so I made them kind of like, I designed it kind of like Legos for different sections that all had interaction, and the interaction is scoped to those sections. So one here, and you can kind of see how I flipped it on the other like responsive side. And then when we look at this responsive Huggy laser panda factory. We can do a couple things here. We can make him, he gets a chip in his head and then becomes lasered, and then like he's getting like painted to become a panda, and then here, you know, he becomes Huggy like you do, and then you can actually just scale it for responsive, and all of the interaction still works on mobile. So that's and it's all a really, really small file size. I think this one is 11 kilobytes. So if you are a developer, I just threw this in here in case you want to do this stuff yourself. I'm using Greenstock timeline, and I have this kind of repeated timeline that I'm calling. So each function is scoped to the actual graphic. And so that like painting area is like the same thing as that little Lego block. So the design and the functions are all similarly scoped. So it's very easy for me to figure out where I'm editing through the whole process. I'm pausing it initially and then just calling that restart whenever somebody touches that area. I talk a lot about functional animation. I have a whole other talk just about functional animation and like how that works for user interfaces. I'm not going to get into that so much here, but I just thought I'd touch on it. And just like how animation can, instead of, I'm showing you things that are like very verbose, but like how the animation can reduce cognitive load. So if you're like working on something like a contact form that comes out of this map, you can like retain that spatial awareness for where you are. You're not seeing a bunch of modals pop in your face and get distracted. This contact becomes the headline here. The email gets out of your way, and when you hit the submit button, you have this loader so that any kind of processes that you're doing on the back end or AJAX requests are happening but don't feel so long for the user. And then you have that kind of big success at the end. And when you're done, you can put it all away, and you know exactly where it went. You know, you're like, oh, it's in there. It's not in anywhere, it's just code. But you know that it's like in that spot. So I'm also thinking a little bit about atmosphere in general and how animation can help and kind of portray that kind of atmospheric quality. So one of the final false dichotomies that I'm going to present is mathematic and precise. So you've got SVGs, which are made with math, and how do we make them look organic and fluid? Like, how do those two things live together? So I started thinking about like smoke in general. So you got like this smoke, and like, how are you going to animate smoke? That's like, that seems pretty complicated. But then if you kind of collapse the shapes and make them much more general, you start to see patterns. You start to see like, oh, well, there's kind of like these bubble things in there. Like, I think I understand those. And like, what are they doing? Okay, they're kind of playing off of each other, and then they're like, you know, getting like the wind and like things around them or pushing them back in while they're moving. So I started making things like this candle out of SVG, and just the idea of like these more fluid forms. So I just drew this in Illustrator, and it's very like simple morphing in a for loop on the side. Oh, I'm also animating a standard deviation of a filter as well. So if I'm like going to break it down in designer terms, we've got like a bunch of different I just pulled these apart and colored them differently so that you can see what I'm doing here. I just drew the other things in gradients in Illustrator, and then I have these kind of like forms, like I made a bunch of different forms that I'm morphing in between, and then I have little tiny guys who are like floating up while that's happening. And then this one in the middle, that's like changing brightness and opacity the whole time. But there's also more than one way of working. I could have done this another way, so let's look at that for just a second. This guy called Blake Bowen was like working with Catmull-Rom spleens, which are really interesting. They have a kind of cool history in computer science. This isn't the first time that people have dealt with Catmull-Rom spleens. But like, so if you want to read an article about it, you can check that out later. But if I had thought about it, like, instead of drawing all those forms, I could have just taken an array of points and changed them up and like had them morph between those points instead of drawing them every time. So there's not just one way of working with SVG either. I also made smoke and a candle kind of burning out. So same kind of premise where probably have to restart this to see, oh no, to see again. But all of them were kind of like hand-drawn in Illustrator real quick, and the smoke is again just morphing between those shapes. I also started playing with motion in general, so this is react motion, and I'm just kind of like playing with the way that motion can behave just in and of itself. So next steps for me, this is the end of the talk, but next steps for me are kind of twofold. Right now I just have this silly repo where I'm rewriting code from other languages and other people's code in Canvas into straight vanilla JavaScript and SVG, just for practice. But I also kind of want to like bring the you saw how I moved away from my drawing and into just like how this code works. I'd like to kind of start to bring those things together again. And I'm doing like silly particle fountains to learn more about physics and things like that. The last things I want to leave you with are again this idea of I can't. I can't is a really, really strong couple of words. It keeps us from so much. And these false dichotomies that we set up for ourselves are really ways to protect ourselves from things that might be us growing and learning. Another popular one is you can't. People might tell you this because they're scared of the things that they've told themselves, or they've set up reality in a certain way to protect themselves and are applying that to you. I would just like everybody to take a second and challenge all of the notions, all of the underlying notions that are keeping you from doing certain things, because perfectionism does kill. And the last thing I'm going to leave you with is a quote that I really, really enjoy. Our deepest fear is not that we're inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we're powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? Your playing small does not serve the world. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people around you won't feel insecure. It's not just some of us, it's everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence liberates others. Thank you.
All right, questions for Sarah?
First of all, wow, that SVG stuff is incredible. As someone who's played around with SVG a little bit for like loading animations and stuff, that makes your stuff all the more incredible. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your process. I know you mentioned Illustrator a little bit and then green something, timeline thing. But what other tools do you use? Anything? Or I saw like the blue mountain sort of thing. Are you like exporting little bits of SVGs and then making them all move individually, or is there some wizardry thing that kind of automates some of this for you, or how do you do it?
I actually stay away from automation. I just like digging into the whys myself, especially because if you have to debug later, anything that's magical is going to really hurt you if anything goes wrong, and things go wrong all the time. So I would say that I start with the most awful looking thumbnails ever. They're these chicken scratches that I'll never show you people, and to kind of plan out where I'm going. And then I'll just go straight into Illustrator. I don't use a Wacom. I know a lot of people do, but I've been using my touchpad for so long now that I feel pretty comfortable with it. But really, whatever you feel comfortable with, you should be working with. And I work in Illustrator, then I export the SVG, and then usually in just one SVG DOM, but I have a couple pens in there that are two, like position absolute on top of each other. It's a little easier, I think, with just one SVG DOM because you're dealing with one space. I use GreenSock a lot for the kind of timeline ones. I've found that anytime you get beyond 2 or 3 kind of chained delays, moving from SVG to, or moving from CSS to GreenSock timeline is a really, or just JavaScript in general allows for a little bit more control. But I wouldn't say that I keep things that consistent either. Like some of these things are done with similar tools, but I use everything under the sun. I'm just a curious person, so I've worked with Smile and with Snap SVG, and I've worked with React Motion, and any kind of velocity, whatever comes out, I try. So I would encourage you to do the same. I like GreenSock a lot as kind of a go-to because it's easy to work with, but I never get anywhere by staying in one place. So yeah.
Big inspiration in how I think learn yeah. But anyway, do you get to choose the animal on the front of your O'Reilly book?
They gave me the option to.
You could have drawn your own.
And I didn't take it because I was too curious about what they would give me.
And then how do you resist the urge not to animate like all the cool little like houses and for sale signs and everything on Trulia?
I think that is mostly because it would get in users' way. I do try to keep it like light and subtle when people are trying to use a product, and only use those kind of crazy animations for like explaining something. Like one that I said in Shop Talk Show even was like a terminal output is a really good way for people to explain how something works with animation. But most of the time on product UI and UX, I'm talking more about like that functional animation that's a little more fun now.
So you talked a little bit about how you started coding with the HTML for Dummies book. But from that time until you moved to San Francisco, were you still coding on the side while you were teaching?
Yeah, I was doing a bit. I did mostly stuff for other scientific, just by word of mouth. People would ask me to do like one-off client work, and I wasn't like progressing as a developer, I would say. I was just taking what I already knew and making like some dummy client sites for a little extra cash because I was broke. But yeah, I wasn't getting better. I was just developing